Well, should we start, Perry? Because
Go for it.
I've been looking forward to this webinar since we talked about it, and I think we started talking about this early part of last year about B Corp and purpose, social purpose, and more. And I think what's going to be really interesting is talking about the experiences that we've had, both in terms of work that we're doing with organisations, our own value set around purpose, but also that whole piece around B Corp. So thank you so much for coming on this webinar. I guess for everyone, I'm sure most people I think will know who you are, but would you like to do an introduction?
We should do, shouldn't we? Yeah. So I'll go first. Thank you, Nick. So yeah, there's nowhere I'd rather be at 11 o'clock today than with you here talking about purpose. And so yeah, Perry Timms, founder and chief energy officer of People and Transformational HR. We're in year 10 of operating. Of course, like everybody, we had the bump in the schedule that was COVID when 2020 hit, but we sort of hunkered down. And during that course, we pursued our B Corporation certification, and it was a long held kind of dream of mine, I suppose, that I am attached to an organisation that shows it cares about things beyond the operation of a normal business and wants to do something good and so on. So yeah, purpose was a really, really important thing for us during that turbulent period and held us together and has manifested itself in that. So really delighted to talk to you today, Nick, about this. So yeah, over to you.
And I'm Nick Court. I'm the CEO of the People Experience Hub. So we are also a B Corp. We got our B Corp accreditation in November, and again, we've been working towards an intro. We'll come back to the purpose stuff. So what do we? I mean, we help organisations, and I guess my piece was knowing that we had to do that from a perspective, a purpose of making work better for people. So it's there. I was just seeing from Kate, and my audio isn't great. Is anyone else
more operatic, perhaps? Yeah, maybe a bit more diaphragm, Nick. Maybe a bit more.
Do you know what I'm going to do?
Yeah, go on then, do it. You are sounding very whispering Bob Harris on the radio for those people who remember him. Well, while you're putting the headphones on and getting your Bluetooth connection, yeah, absolutely. I think people experience, as Rob posted a terrific post only this week on LinkedIn talking about people experience and the whole sense of culture have suddenly become incredibly topical for people to talk about, not just Great Resignation, but COVID and impacts, and just this sense that businesses need to take that much more seriously than simply stacking up numbers and so on. So yeah, are you connected now via your
I'm connected. Is that better?
Look at that. Whoa.
Boom.
Silky smooth. Beautiful. Right, there you go. I filled in. Back
brilliant
to you.
Stuff. So I'm gonna start with a quote. So when Rob joined our business and I spoke to Rob about purpose, I remember saying to Rob, we were doing an insights report at the time, and I said, I want to think more about alignment and purpose and how that works. And I said, we've got some stuff in our insights report from data that we have, Rob, but how do we describe it? How do we describe it? And he wrote the following. So he wrote, alignment and purpose as concepts are getting more and more airtime as organizations see that their mission, the way they operate, and how they are perceived is more important than ever before. Having employees aligned to these goals, objectives, and principles is just as vital to organizational success as it is to employees wanting to work for a business with purpose. Having a common goal not only aligns people to your organization, it aligns them to their colleagues. Striving towards shared goals will mean that people collaborate more and will invest time in solving not just their problems, but also the barriers and other teams people will have. Empathy and collaboration win when goals are well communicated, meaningful, and achievable. And I haven't revisited that for a while because we did that report in 2020, I think, and I haven't revisited that. But I was almost like, well, if you were writing a business case for why purpose from an organizational psychology perspective, from just a people perspective, that really hit home to me. And is that what you see? You know,
Oh
does that?
gosh, yeah. I mean, that was like a Sermon on the Mount type moment there. Do you know what I mean? That's like capturing not just some very nice words that quite elegantly describe purpose, because it can be something that people perhaps get a little bit hyped up about. It's very grounded, it's very realistic, so the wording is elegant, but I think it's how it makes you feel that is the strong determinant about whether purpose is absolute or it's some kind of fake trickery marketing ploy, right? Now, I don't even work for you, but I felt all that. I was kind of thinking, blimey, if you were recruiting, I'd be like, what do I need to do to step into your space? And I think we underplay sometimes the emotional, psychological, and dare I say it, spiritual connection that people can have when it moves them to want to be part of it, right? And so that's the sort of magic bit of it. And there is science, as you found out, because that's what you're in the game of science, data, points of reference that can describe behavioral tendencies and what that means for an impact and an outcome. So yeah, it totally is that. It made me go back and have a look at what we state as well. So I'm glad you prompted me to do that.
And you read something that, you know, so I guess I have a question, which is my first question for you is,
Yeah.
you know, we've talked about B Corp, we've talked about purpose. The balance of social purpose and organizational purpose. So can a business have purpose without having social purpose?
Oh, I guess it can to a degree, because perhaps the reason that people came together was to create some very exciting business venture that would see them in a position of I don't know, excitement and attraction and appeal, and of course revenue, right? So most people would set up a business not just to do something good unless it was a non-profit. They would want to see that it could, you know, sustain their lifestyle and enhance it, right? So I think they start from that, but I think it very quickly starts to become evident that whatever you step into with that business venture, you are part of a bigger ecosystem of things that you will then need to take account of. Now, I'm working with a tech company right now, and they are incredibly deliberate about what their service proposition is to their people, and they've done very well with it. But you can see the tension that's emerging now, and it's a good tension. They're like, but this is not all we want to be. We want to be great on social mobility and inclusion for the people who come to our workplace. They're already starting to think about outreach, education, and for people who are disadvantaged to get a chance to work in a place that has a product that's very well defined, but wants to do it with some soul and spirit. And they don't have to do that, but you can tell they're picking that vibe up. So even if you don't start with that, I think it emerges, and you can either dismiss it and say, I don't really care, or you can absorb it and go, actually, do you know what? This could be better for us to have that broader sense that we're not just here to build a product. We've got a social purpose too that's emerged. So I think, yeah, I think it can come, and I think you can be very deliberate about it very early on in your kind of maturity. Yeah.
I guess the thing I'd add to that as well, having been through that startup phase, is there's stuff that you can do that doesn't have a cost factor. There's about behaviors, there's stuff that you can do, but actually, the more successful you are as an organization, the more you're able to do. And you know, the more people that you have, the more influence you have, the more customers you have, the more influence you can have. And it reminds me of there's a study by Alex Edmonds, who's a professor of London School of Economics. And he did some research on 28 years of company information, and found that actually companies that had purpose behind them before profit tended to do better with their shareholders, communities in general. And he came up with a strapline. I'll get it wrong, but it was something along the lines of, it's purpose that allows you to make profits, that allows you to invest back into people and purpose again. It's not people delivering your cash goals that allow you to do this. So you have to start from that position. And just looking at a statement from his book about pie growing mentality. Yeah, he said a company's primary goal is to serve society rather than generate profits. And surprisingly, this approach typically ends up being more profitable than if profits were the end goal. And I find that stuff really fascinating. And I think what we need to make sure we don't fall into is a loftiness trap, because you know, a goal in society can sometimes be providing employment.
exactly.
Giving people that value.
Yeah.
And I guess, it's kind of thinking about some of the stuff. I've got some of our statistics here, just to prompt some extra stuff. So when we looked at alignment, so we looked back over a huge amount of data points, and most companies that we work with tend to be interested in alignment and purpose and meaningful work. They know the value within that. And actually alignment across all of our indices was always the highest scoring. Yeah. Right. So, there's a lot of organizations who are getting it right. And, it might be that, companies that are more interested in employee feedback are more likely to be aligning with their organization. And therefore, if you're carrying out this kind of work, it's more likely to be high. But what did we see? We saw 75% of people said that they were aligned to their company's purpose. And we saw that 88% of people said that they felt proud to be working towards their company goals. And you got me thinking, these are really good and high scores. But what's the flip of that? And I've got some numbers on what's the impact of when alignment is low, because in organizations it may be high, but across the piece it was low. So what did we see when alignment to company's purpose was low? We saw that advocacy dropped by 44 percentage points. We saw that trust dropped by 40 percentage points. We saw that belonging dropped by 44 percentage points. And here's a really interesting one. We saw that organizational effectiveness had no change, which really does play into that hearts and minds piece of purpose, which is organizational effectiveness. When we think about it, it's the effectiveness of policies and procedures, the machinery I'm using, the kit I have to work on. And we didn't really see a change. I'm going to come back to that later, but I guess in terms of what you've seen working with organizations, does this ring true? Because these are our numbers, and it could be a bit of a marketing ploy.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It really does. So when I introduce myself, and I've got this slide with all the logos on of people who've asked us to come in and help them work on things, I say the one common across them all, and there's some recognizable brands and some not known brands, and there's whatever's in there. I say the one common thing is that they wanted to create something better for their own people that would result in performance improvements or adaptability and diversification of product line or whatever it might be. And in some cases, it's even coping with really compressed budgets like in local government. But that wasn't just to balance the books. It was to be fair to the people who were having to serve under that restrictive covenant, right? So I absolutely would say that. And I describe it as being really quite fortunate that we only get that brief. We don't get a brief that says, bust a competition or create some kind of different market share or get more out of our people without them knowing that we're pressing them even harder. And it's not even tokenistic well-being gestures either. It's genuinely beyond that. So these are people who feel what you've just described. And I think those data points would absolutely back up probably what their own data points are there. They know they've got people really committed, but perhaps frustrated by constraints or bureaucracy or layering or some inhibitor to them having what we describe as a flourishing experience of work. And so that's what we end up helping them do. And I think the sort of the bells that chime in our minds when we think about this go back for me when Dan Pink talked about drive in such a way that was so well packaged. He said this sort of sense of a transcendent purpose is a key part of what motivates people when money's off the table. And then it's about autonomy and mastery too. And purpose then, to me, wasn't something I'd naturally computed as a really strong determinant of how people are aligned. But it absolutely hit home then. It was like, right, totally get it. And I think we did see some reaction on that where people started to get a little bit conflated with it and tried to dress it up in nice speak and stuff, but it was a bit fake. And I think there are some who've suffered a backlash on that. Like, you told me this is what it was going to be. And my experience is it isn't. So I think, the downturn that you experienced in belonging and advocacy and trust and stuff, that, I don't care how people dress it up, that is performance impairing activity at the highest level. But it's wrong to people to have that experience at a kind of humanitarian level, if you know what I mean. So if you do exist to, create some product that doesn't save the world, but you are doing economic good for a part of the country that needs jobs, then do that, but do it fairly to those people. They're not commodities. They're not part of that value chain that you can just discard and not even care about high attrition. I was in a session with some leaders in a well-known brand that does a lot of call center work as both sales and help. And they had super high attrition in some areas. And he stood there in front of the rest of his management team and said, I'm telling you now, the board don't care about that. They don't care about turnover. They think all they're looking for is people who want some two-bit job to keep them through, and churn is a natural part of that. And I could see these other managers being really repelled by that, going, I'm supposed to lead people knowing that. And you could tell they weren't happy at all, because they had an aspiration to create a place where the work might have been routine, but it's good for people to establish into careers, restart careers, build themselves up. But the leadership team just didn't want it. And it's like, that's not a sustainable model by any stretch. So yeah, the opposite of it can be quite damaging.
Well, and I think that actually you've made some interesting points, and I've made a note actually, because I know from some research we're just doing on exit interviews, which is that around 30% of people who leave an organization say that the experience of the organization and the expectation of the experience were different. Yeah, now we I haven't got those statistics around meaningful work, alignment, and purpose, and around that defining to purpose. But I'm gonna take a next step to go and look at that.
Yeah.
What we did see is, you talked about a few things around, if you've got purpose, that purpose has to flow through your organization into your practices. And if you're dealing with people, then you almost have an obligation to deal with people fairly and equitably. And one of the things that we saw actually, what did we see that had an impact on people's alignment to companies' goals and purposes? And one of those things we saw was trust. So in organizations where there were low trust, we saw a 20 percentage point drop in alignment. Ooh. Yeah. So not in organizations necessarily, but in departments or in pockets, we saw that, that alignment score dropped 20 percentage points. And I'm always worried about, quoting our numbers, because, but actually, if you go in there, there's a guy called Paul Zak, professor of economics at Claremont University, who's done a big piece of work on trust. And what he found is people in high trust climates were 70% more aligned to their company's purpose. Right. So it's almost we'll come back to the takeaways from this, but we're not talking about single issue politics here. Now, we're not talking about this is a one measure that solves everything. It's if you have purpose, you now need to start branching out and thinking about other things: fairness, trust, equitable. Unfair pay practices, interestingly, I was talking about this with Rob this morning. So when people saw or they perceived unfair pay practices, that also had a 20 percentage point drop on alignment to companies' goals and purposes. Now, that absolutely isn't directly about purpose. It's about feeling of fairness and equity. But what it does is it demonstrates your point, which is, if you're going to have purpose, whatever that purpose may be, you have to then have it as a considered and designed piece of work that says, does this flow through all that we do? Top to bottom, left to right.
Completely. I've got an example actually that supports that in a non-profit area, a local authority we work with in the Northwest, who were desperately trying to digitise some services to make them more accessible to people and start a little bit of a revolution in bringing more people who were perhaps digitally disadvantaged into services that were more optimal, quick, easy, functional for them to pay certain things and so on, right? So that's what they wanted to do. And they had a bit of a 3-year program to do this. And in their first probably sort of 12 months of it, they tried to get some products out and they flopped, and they were a bit concerned about what was going on. There was no accusation that the teams developing them had got it wrong, but they just couldn't get to the heart of what mattered for their citizens. And then when I came in to work with them, they already had the inkling of what they wanted to do, and I helped accelerate that thought into action. They brought people who had high touch experience with customers, off the front line into product development. And they'd never done that before, because they thought, well, don't we have to train them, and they don't know the tech and all that. It's like, but they know the customer. So we started that. We skilled 100 people up in a methodology that was based around agile, to develop products with that sense of iteration and input and so on. And by their own admission, some of these people who stepped away from frontline were like, I'm not sure what I can add here, but I heard the cry and I thought I could represent customers. Anyway, long and short of that story is, because they sort of loosened the feel of it and they dropped hierarchical control, and they said, do whatever you need to do. We're not going to determine it because we want you to design the products for people. They absolutely hit the purpose element of what they're there to do as a civic office in everything they designed. The tech went out, and within 6 months they had 8 or 9 products getting super leverage in their communities. And then they went and won Digital Council of the Year in 2018. So from failed products to success that got them that gong, because they opened up and got purpose-led people who had high-touch customer representation to shape products. And these people were saying things like, in all my 23 years of working here, I've never had so much like enjoyable and fulfilling experiences of work than when I was let into play. And they continue to do that now. That's their MO now. And their citizen centricity, I suppose you'd say, has improved the level of kind of connectivity with communities. They don't have to deal with so many complaints. They sharpen processes left, right, and centre. Their COVID response was super collaborative and super responsive. And they think it's because they changed their culture, because they allowed purpose to be the determinant of why you step in to solve a problem for customers and clients and citizens. So it absolutely does that.
It's huge, isn't it? And it probably, I mean, it brings me on to, I'm just trying to think which question I've got. So I think I've got a question around conflict. So,
right.
So I was talking to someone recently about the Great Resignation, whether it's a thing, whether it isn't a thing. But people are certainly more considered around who they work for, and that's the impression. That's the impression we get. And I have a concern myself, which is if you can choose where to work, there's a privilege within that. Yeah, you are privileged. If you can leave an employer because you disagree with an element of that employment and go and work somewhere else.
Agreed.
You have a privilege in terms of that there is availability of job for you, whether it's whether it's in the geography you're working, or whether it's the industry you work in, or whether it's a skill set you have.
Yeah.
But I know also there'll be a whole group of people, whether it's about geography or the role that they do, where they have less choice in where they work, but will still have purpose at the heart of what they do. And they may be working for an organization that has a conflicting purpose. That organization may be absolutely about profit and employment, and maybe not a lot else. How does that work? How does how does that come about? What happens when you have that general conflict? But I have no choice. This is the choice I have, is to work here.
Yeah. I agree with you, because I think there's sometimes lots of thought leadership out there that says, you don't like it, you take it somewhere else. But the economics of it for some people are just like, I can't do that. That's so high risk for me, it's unreal. And yet I find that conflict in what the company stands for and how it manifests itself, and what I believe is just, fair, true and meaningful to me just don't align. So there's a couple of tactics, I suppose. What I've seen in some of those environments is quite literally people withdraw into a team and they almost create a force field around them to go, okay, they don't understand us, they put pressure on us, but let's look after ourselves. And I've even been into some environments where, I've got the brief, I've got the kind of normally it's the HR team's mandate, but the board needs some convincing, and they're ready to throw stones at any project that seems like it's not going to get them where they need to get to. But HR's got a different idea and wants to create some kind of centre of creativity perhaps elsewhere to showcase that. So we form this force field around us, and we absolutely look after ourselves. So what I see there is the purpose becomes redefined much closer to people. Saying, look, we know the company's purpose is this, but our purpose is this experiment to prove this concept, to shift the dial. We need to look after each other. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to do the other. And they craft a purpose that creates that force field. What I've then seen is all that research about high performing teams absolutely manifests itself, because they have utter clarity about where they're going. And it might not be exactly what the company's North Star is, but it's their North Star in their environment at that time to prove something. And they galvanize to that. And what I've seen is then some real shifts in how people then start to talk, demonstrate, challenge, be creative. But ultimately, they look after each other and they create a duty of care to each other, very explicitly, very agreed, almost formal, but still very human, and get on with the job. And it's brilliant to see that happen, because what they do is they've got a purpose. It's just not that big conflated society changing company rhetorical thing. It's their own. It's like, why are we here together now to do what we're doing? And they build a purpose. So I don't think purpose has to always be like a moonshot or some Martin Luther King type thing. It can just be what's important to us right now. And Amy Edmondson's Psychological Safety says this: set the stage. What are we here to do? What matters? And it absolutely gives people a chance to succeed and look after each other. Now, if you're in a toxic environment, but you've got a team of people around that can create that force field, I'm not suggesting it's the healthiest thing to do forever, but it will at least give you some tolerance and bandwidth and maybe some good examples, start to build your confidence and credentials to think about going somewhere else, to create that privilege. But if not, it'll at least make it much more tolerable for you. So yeah, that's how I've seen it happen.
And I think that's what I've seen as well. And I've also seen, in particular, where you have specialists. So it might be someone who's a reward specialist or someone who's a technical architect or whatever that might be. They start to have their prime loyalty is to their profession, not to their company. And what they then do is start their purpose comes from a professional purpose, not from an organizational purpose. And again, I think that's great for that individual or for the team that individual is in. But I guess the risk there is what the company starts to do is to lose control of over, and I'll use the word culture as a coverall, but they start to lose that control of what their culture is, because they now have pockets of people, and I guess there'll be pockets of people who can't create that force field, who are experiencing a more negative environment, whether that be a gift of a leader or a manager within that team with the force field. And I guess flipping this around as well, we've seen some stuff around the impact of communication. And you can be an organization with purpose, and if you don't communicate that, what's the impact? And kind of looking at this, we saw that poor communication. So if you want people to get behind what you're doing, you have to communicate. In high communication environments around purpose, we saw that actually the score was beating our actual average score. It's around 74%. But in where communication was perceived as poor or people didn't understand what was going on, we saw it at 43%, massive difference. So we know that communication is high. And so Nick's made a comment, hasn't he, around so what's he said there? So as a reward practitioner, our purpose and loyalty should be to our employees, not the company. So. And that is actually a really nice, purposeful statement to say as well, isn't it? It's around, somebody who says, I care first and foremost about the people within my care. And I guess in terms of that communication, you've got to effectively communicate that purpose. You've got to communicate, and whatever that purpose may be. And again, I think sometimes we get hung up on lofty goals around we're going to solve the green agenda, we're going to be CO2 neutral, we're going to whatever it is that we're going to do. But actually, sometimes the purpose can be simpler, but effectively you've got to communicate it to employees so that they understand it, and that then becomes that hearts and minds stuff. Getting people to going back to Rob's point around alignment. If you want alignment, you have to let people know what they're lining behind. And actually, just for everyone that's on, if anyone has any comments or wants to jump in with anything, it's an open webinar. We'd love to hear what people are saying. And actually, I have got a question to the people on the webinar. So the people attending, how many of you would say that you have purpose or high purpose within either what you do as your role or you as an individual. So forget the organization you may work for, or whether you work for yourself. Do you feel that you have purpose? Do you feel that you're in a high purpose role? And I'll come back to that in a minute, but just be really interested to see how many people are talking about that.
And while people are doing so, Nick, I'll just do a reflection on me and let's say the team at PTHR. So because we've talked it into existence, the team know that there are sometimes I'm representing the mission and I'm representing the profession, not always at the same time, not always tracking back to PTHR. So they know that I don't just talk about PTHR or I don't just talk about our mission. I might go very heavy on the profession because my purpose is bigger than just PTHR. My purpose is to shift this profession into what it could and should be. And so they know there's sometimes a detachment from that. And it's sometimes difficult for them to go, but how does that help us? It's like in the round, I think it does, but I can't help that that's my alignment. Part of my alignment is that. And so therefore I will detach from who I am and what I do for a living and talk about the professional field that I've become very attached to and am part of. And they kind of get it. And they manifest that sometimes in things like Kirsten will talk about the green agenda and sustainability. She's not always doing that with a PTHR lens on. She's just doing it from, I want to stand in that space. And she was really strong in getting us climate positive. And it became more meaningful for us because it was so meaningful to her. So that was a contagious sense of purpose, actually, that not everybody felt at the time, but because she advocated it so well, it became something we really, really wanted to do. So that's how some of this stuff can grow. You can find it and you can share it and invite people into a particular nuance on what that purpose is. So, yeah.
So we've had some really good comments around how people are clear on their purpose and how they feel that they have purpose. And I'm going to talk a little bit. So you talked before about some work that you'd done, and I know you've done work within government sectors and stuff like that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we've done in the same place. So councils and schools or education, and by their very nature, these are organisations who serve a community. And have a community focus because of that. And you may not perceive that when you're in the community. You may be a bit annoyed that your bin hasn't been emptied today, or something's got in the way of something and you're paying your council tax or whatever that may be. But the people in those organisations have to be community focused, whether they're looking after the education of the children in the community, the safety of the children in the community, the care of the elderly in the community, whatever that might be. There's a huge social element here, and their purpose, therefore, is clear outside of the general purpose of the organisation. What we found was that typically the results we were getting back around environmental, and I should probably mention, we have a framework which is a 3-part framework, so environmental, experiential, and outcome. And what we were finding was that the scores for the environment people worked in, the environmental scores, were average to low, if we're honest. But when we talk about engagement, and I'm going to talk about engagement because I think it's just a common language people will use, engagement was high. And it was high because it was driven by purpose. So what we could see is, while the environment was low, the location, the facilities was low to average. The purpose drove that engagement score high. So any of the scores that captured overall engagement were high. But so for engagement, we know that purpose appears to have a bigger impact than environment. But what does it lead to? And what we've actually seen is that it leads to that people of high purpose, people who have a sense of purpose, be that the NHS, be that, we see it a lot in people in HR. When I look at HR data, I see this a lot. So people that have a high sense of purpose in the role that they're doing make short-term sacrifices because of their environmental impacts. They pick up the slack. So if I haven't got the best computer to do my job, I work longer hours. If the environment isn't so great, I bring my own stuff in. I bring my own clothing because the PPE isn't great. So they make sacrifices because they're high purpose driven. but it's not sustainable. And one of the reasons about not having a single element as your measure of overall experience. But
Yeah.
what we saw, and this is the crux of it, and this is why, to everyone that's on the webinar who's listening, my call out is to look after yourselves, because we saw that where there was a high sense of purpose with people in their roles, that flowed through into well-being. And
yeah,
we saw burnout, we saw stress, we saw lack of sleep over the job. And again, Rob gave some great insight in this. Rob Robson gave some great insight into this, which is when you are purposeful and the role you deliver is purposeful, then everything you do fundamentally is important. Because if you don't do something, there is an impact. If you don't do something well, there is an impact. If you forget something, there is an impact, because you have purpose and you then align your values to that. So it's well-being. And I think you made a comment about well-being earlier, and I think maybe Nick Butcher in the comments made something about well-being. I'm not sure, I might have just imagined that. But I'm almost in a place, actually, it goes back to that. Purpose isn't one thing, engagement isn't one thing. You have to take a more holistic view. And if you've got purposeful people, and if you are purposeful, your well-being is really important. Yeah, because you're more likely to be running hot.
Yep.
And that's what our data is telling us.
I'd back it up because Deloitte did some research at the back end of 19, so it was pre-COVID, and they brought in some research from possibly Northwestern University, I can't remember, but it was academically verified, and it said that in looking at companies who were categorized as purpose-led versus not, those non-purpose-led companies had higher death rates and heart disease in their workforce than the purposeful ones. And they did a cross section that was a different sector and age group and everything, right? So this is not, distorted by anything. It was literally, they had a purpose-led camp and a not purpose-led camp, and the purpose-led camp had higher health in their workforce. And that's backed up by Buurtzorg, the self-managed nursing organization in the Netherlands, that's actually translated to patient safety as well, and patient healthcare improvement, lower hospital rates, lower emergency call outs, and so on and so forth, because the purpose-led nursing model at Buurtzorg is part of their delivery to people who are at the receiving end of their services. So it actually creates healthier customers and clients as well, believe it or not. So I think this stuff in terms of humanitarianism, if you want to call it that, and the health and wellbeing agenda, absolutely is the case. Some people might say, well, I've seen some really purposeful organizations where people are so committed to it, they don't even recognize their signs of burnout, and they burn out. Passion can be quite a blind spot sometimes in, I need to check my health in, but I've got to do this work because I love it so much. Manfred De Vries has done some research on cult organizations, and that's what that's talking to, an organization that becomes a bit cult-like rather than purpose-led. And we've seen that in tech, and we've seen that in, Basecamps blow up and Ubers blow up, where they're so cult-like, it even creates toxic cultures, even though their mission is quite lofty and they're revered in certain regards. So it's a fine balance. And as you say, I think there is a read back to the multiple perspectives and points that both purpose, the culture side of things you're talking about, the experience, and then to Kate Griffiths-Lambert's point, values. And it's really interesting when I try to model something to explain almost like our principles about what we do in helping people create systems for people that work for them. We took great lengths to make sure energy was referenced in it, because that's a big thing of mine. I didn't use the word engagement. I used the word influence, because I think you can be engaged, but you can't influence changes that you know are better, and that creates a health issue, because you're like, I'm so committed to my customers or citizens or whatever it might be in the role you're doing, like in government, but I can't change the things that are making that so hard for me. Therefore, I'm double frustrated. I'm revving high, like you said, and that's not healthy for me. So I think the determinant there isn't, are you engaged? The determinant is, what can you influence to make changes that are better for you to deliver what you need to more sustainably?
Yeah,
and that's a values thing.
And going on to the values piece a little bit more, I find it fascinating, because I also think it's an area that organizations can sometimes struggle with in terms of aligning their values, and values will change, won't they? And it's kind of, we had this conversation, when we started the organization, and it was, it was 2 people. The values that we put in were probably appropriate for 2 people to guide themselves. And when now, we're a big organization, we need to keep reviewing those values. We added a new value in, we added something in to help underpin stuff, which was a fairly broad do the right thing value. But we see it a lot around that value proposition that people put in, and they design values around maybe behaviors they want to see, or they design values around that. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm not a values expert, and so I'm not going to talk too long about it. But I do think, again, if you are designing values and you have your purpose in mind, and you're working with your people, and you're aligning values to what people see and they feel, then you won't go far wrong, and let those values drive people. And there's nothing wrong about setting aspirational values in. And we were having this conversation with a client recently around, they're doing a values piece of work. They aspire to have a value, but they know that value isn't lived in their organization right now. So they're looking at what steps they can put in place to create that. Andy Gorham's also made a really interesting point around communications. So about the importance of communicating your purpose internally, but also not over energizing that externally, because and I agree with that. And sometimes, I sometimes feel that, we have to stop ourselves as an organization. I want to bang the B Corp drum over and over and over and over again. But that's because I'm proud. I'm proud of it, and I want other people to go, that was good, Nick. And it's my motivation, one, to say we're a B Corp, or is my motivation to say we've done this. And I do think that's really important. If you're communicating, you communicate with purpose. And I think this whole piece is really, really interesting. And yes, it is my own clothing, Nick. It wasn't a bet. So I do think that stuff is super interesting. And we're coming to the last 15 minutes. And I wanted to talk about, so we'll kind of do the last 10 minutes as a wrap up. How does a company find its North Star? So it's and I guess very, very quickly, how did the People Experience Hub find its North Star? So our prime purpose is to transform the experience of people at work. Nice. That's it. And it simply came from, I was dissatisfied with what I was seeing in the industry, dissatisfied with what I saw, and a little bit of, I don't want to say purpose washing as such, but a little bit of, actually, you're clearly a profit company. Your purpose is profit and cash. That's your goal. You're not doing what you're doing for any reason other than to make some cash, because I can see the way you're doing it. So there was a couple of things for me, which was we had to start with purpose, but we were mature in our journey, we were mature in our funding, and we could start with purpose. But if I'm an organization that's already started, and I'm unclear about a social purpose, an organizational purpose outside of profit, where do I start? What do I do?
I'll give you a live example, then I'll sort of describe ours. Well, it's not live, but it was at the time when I went into the organization. It was in publishing, and I had a team of people there who were denying the nature of what was set up as the purpose as being valid. And I said, okay, well, let's boil it down then. What really is the purpose? And all they kept talking about was kind of profiteering and market share. And I was like, that's an outcome of what you should exist to do. So don't tell me the outcome, tell me why you exist. And it was only when I forced a detachment from that outcome that they actually started to think about the reason we exist is, and they started to elegantly describe some of the features of its heritage, because it was hundreds of years old, its place in the market, its I suppose it's almost like its bastion of faith in quality journalism and stuff kind of came through. I'm like, right, now point to me how that helps you achieve the outcome of profit share and so on and so forth. And they started to, and because they were in HR, it was almost like, what are we needing to do to remove some blockages then that you're seeing that don't let that happen anyway? So that was it. So they had a purpose, but they felt it wasn't right, and they tried to create this sort of sense of, well, all they care about is money at the top and stuff. I'm like, okay, but the real purpose was what they described, and you could see them shift, and you could see them want to do things differently. So I think you have to have that really frank conversation about, forget perhaps why we were founded, what's right now that thing that we exist to do. And I think talk it into existence. And I've seen people really chew on words to try and get the right frame and phraseology. And you can go through the exercise of like, right, explain it to a 5-year-old and do those kind of things, that really boil it up in different ways. So I think you can do that. But again, I keep saying to people, I don't want you to just say the words. I want you to also describe to me what you're feeling at the time that somebody says those words to you, because if there's no emotional attachment to it, not purposeful enough. It's a blandish statement of marketing spiel. It's got to make you feel something, which is like, wow. I spoke to the founder recently of an organization in India called Jaipur Rugs, and they've got thousands of people out of poverty by having an almost like franchising model for rug making. Now, when he describes the purpose to me, I literally felt like I was shivering, because it was so bloody powerful, and it was only across a Zoom like this, because he's crafted that so well because of what they do now, that you can imagine everybody kind of going, oh, wow, how can we ever compete with that? Well, you don't compete with it. You just create your version of what you do that means something to people in the same way that he's done. So I think there's definitely something in that. So how we describe ourselves, and actually in a purpose sense, we also want to visualize us within it as well, because I think sometimes purpose can feel like some NASA type mission, but I think it's got to also manifest who you are. So ours is, we are a connected, collaborative enterprise of conscious business activists with audacious dreams of better business for a better world. So I want to see us feel like we're activists, we're conscious, and that's what we're striving for. And actually, when we've tried to play around with it, we always keep coming back going, that's it, that's still us, that's who we are, and that's how we manifest our purpose. So I think you've got to keep playing with it until the point that people have an emotional reaction to it, because if they don't, it's not good enough and it's marketing.
And actually, do you know what, it's Nick Butcher once said this to me, so I know he's on the webinar. Was his rule of thumb on something that is broadly complex and has business speak attached to it was, does it pass the pub test? Could you go and have? Could you go and sit in a pub, have a pint, coffee shop, have a coffee, nice peppermint tea with somebody, and just say to the person next to you, this is what I do, and this is what our company's strapline is. And would they understand it, having no idea who you are and what you do? And I think actually some of that purpose stuff, we do get locked into that. We do get locked into. I know. So we're in our last 9 minutes, and I guess so. I've got some.
The beer test. Nice.
I've got some takeaway stuff. But what would you say? What are your top 3 tips, takeaways for people to take from this webinar? And I know it probably just felt it's like a big conversational webinar. But what would you say are your top 3 tips?
So I think the first tip is that there will be people who will just want it to equate to a mathematics thing about profit and numbers and so on. And so they'll say, tell me what purpose does to that. There's evidence out there that shows you this in numerical senses, right? Here's a statistic that over 12 years, Cantor did some research, 175% value increase in purpose-led companies versus not. That stacks up brilliantly. CBI produced a report. There's all sorts of things out there, right? So if anybody's going to say it's not worth spending the time in, give them that to chew on. So that's your first thing. I think the second thing then is what I talked about, which is when you craft it, when you describe it, and Andy's talked to this in the chat too, it's got to be a co-created thing, I think. If you're a massive organization, you might think, how am I going to handle all those data points? It's like, you've got to, because if you want people to care about it, everybody needs to feel it, right? So get as much input as you can to what it means to people. and then build that into something and test it. And the test is, does it make you have an emotional reaction? Because if it's only intellectual, it's not quite good enough. So that's the second tip. And then the third tip, I think, is it absolutely has to do, to Kate's point, influence the way you describe your values, what your principles are, what is considered violations, what drives diversification, product improvement, and so on and so forth. You've got to kind of go, is that purpose in mind when we're making this change or looking at this M&A or doing this or whatever? It's got to keep coming back up to that, because ultimately, if it can't pass that test, you shouldn't be doing it. That's what I'd say.
Mega, that's awesome. And I just think this stuff is like, I get chills. I get chills talking about this stuff because I just know it's so important. And I guess the summary, the summary I've got that from this conversation is kind of beware the loftiness trap. You don't have to save the world. Yeah, your purpose doesn't have to be saving the world. Yeah, playing into what you were saying, they practice what you preach. So if you're going to do it, you've got to do it, and it's got to flow through your organization in everything you do, and be prepared as well for somebody to challenge you. And I spent a lot of time at Tesco, and the values set in Tesco and the employee Tesco's actually gave people permission to challenge people. And actually, if you're going to have purpose and values assigned to it, people will challenge you on what you do, and therefore you have to live it. Don't be idealistic and too naive about this stuff. There are going to be tensions to deal with. Yeah, and that's going to happen. Purpose might be specific, actually. So it might be specific right now. It might be specific to a team or a group, and it can change. Yeah. So it's about what's really important to us today. Where do we want to go? And be ready to make that change. Purpose doesn't have to be a fixed point on the horizon. Yeah, that horizon can just continually be moving. And we know that purpose and well-being must be connected. And be careful. Too much of a good thing. Our view of, if all you're doing is measuring engagement, that might be just driven by purpose and people burning out. Yeah, just because high engagement is in place doesn't mean anything else. And ultimately, yes, it's that holistic perspective. If you're not thinking about your values, your overall culture, the way you do things, any purpose you have in place can almost become an irrelevance.
Nicely put. I'll leave you a little story of a taxi ride where the taxi driver was taking me to a speaking thing I was doing. And so I started talking to him about what it was. He said, well, how would you describe that then in the world of work? I said, well, I'm in HR. He went, I wouldn't have thought that was HR. And so I started to tell him a bit more about it. By the end of the taxi journey, he said, my daughter's currently studying at university and thinks she wants to go into HR. He said, I was trying to persuade her out of it. He said, but talking to you now, I'm going to give her a chance to think about it a bit more deeply, because what I sense from you is that's where real difference could be made. And I thought, blimey, that's not even trying to persuade anybody that purpose matters, but it worked. Yeah, it worked.
That's huge. That is huge. So I guess we've got a few minutes. If anyone has a question, raise your hand now, drop a question over, and we can answer it. If while anyone thinks about that, I'm going to say a big thank you, Perry. And I think to myself that it's, you are what, 12 miles from where I am.
Yeah.
And you're up north when I'm down south. You're in the east when I'm in the west. And and we're out there doing stuff. Geographically, we're in the same location, and we're more virtually aligned than anything else. I don't know who won the FA Cup in 1939.
Portsmouth, 4-1.
Oh well, that's a shame. I'm from Southampton, so I'm not. I believe I'm not a football fan, but I believe that I should be a bit grumpy about that.
He did that on purpose, clearly.
So we've got another webinar coming up in March. We're going to get some information out, which is going to be Rob Robson's going to be running that. As soon as we got all the details, we're going to get that stuff out. What's next for you, Perry? Where are you going in the next few weeks? What are you up to?
Next few weeks, we've got loads of client work at the moment. So after a sluggish start in 2022, we've got about 20 on the books, and it's in housing, education, all sorts of things. So I'm diving into that and enjoying it, because it's where people are really starting to go, help me get this thing right. And that's good news. So that's what I'm up to.
Rob's. I wasn't aware we've got. So Rob Robson's confirmed that the next webinar is with Mr. Rob Baker.
It's a double Rob.
So 2 Robs, and it's going to be on autonomy and job crafting. So we'll get the details out to everyone. So again, thank you everyone that has attended. Perry, I have thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation.
Me too.
And that's it. We're done.
Excellent job done. Brilliant stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye, everyone.
Helping it. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.